Please join me in welcoming Barbara Steinberg. Good afternoon. I hope you're enjoying your lunch. I am so excited to be the one to come into this space and to help tap in to actually your heart space. I spend the majority of my time working alongside educators regardless of professional role, working on instruction and intervention and how we accommodate. And the Early Life Conference said, you know, we would really love you to just tell your story. And I was like, but that's not really a whole lot of what I do. And through lots of conversation, we decided that more now than ever, we need a renewed sense of hope and purpose. And so I'm honored that I get to share my story, because I'm going to guess that my story is your story because your story is my story. In fact, every single one of us has a story about what brought us to this work. I don't care what your professional hat is. You enter education because you want to make a difference. And we have stories that have challenged us. We have stories of success. And my guess is that if you've been at this work long enough, you've asked yourself the question at least once, why do we stay? Because while this work is meaningful, it is also really challenging. My own story through teaching and through literacy is what has allowed me to show up year after year in spite of policy that maybe doesn't make sense, in spite of systems that may not be working at their optimal rate. We all make a commitment to show up every single day, and my story begins here. This is my All About Me book. It sits on a shelf in my office, and before I was Barbara Steinberg, I was Barbie Cuff, not my preferred name. And you can see that from a very early age, I knew that I wanted to be a teacher. But I also knew something else. I had no interest whatsoever in teaching students how to learn to read. What I loved was helping older students, primarily 4th and 5th graders, wrestle with big ideas. I loved putting text in front of them that were both mirrors to their own lives and windows to the world. I loved making connections that were personal, connections to other texts, connections to the world. That's what I wanted to do in education. Yet, education had something else in mind for me. Because I noticed really early on that I had not just a handful of 4th and 5th graders, but a significant number that when I would put those texts in front of them, they really struggled to read. And when I would look at a piece of their writing, it was like their ideas were there, but trapped. The handwriting was illegible, the spelling made it so difficult to decode, and I really didn't understand what was happening. I was working hard, they were working hard, but their progress just didn't match their effort. And even worse than the academic gap was watching these students shrink. I saw shoulders curl inward. I saw eyes drop when it was time for reading, writing, and literacy. I saw 10-year-olds carrying that quiet weight of shame, and I didn't know how to fix it. One day I happened to be walking down the hallway, and I passed the intervention room and I peeked in. And a group of my then 5th graders were sitting around the kidney table with the interventionists, working with these wooden blocks that had letters on reading words and spelling words, changing one sound at a time, and I had no idea whatsoever what I was looking at. It might as well have been Chinese. And I was really curious what was happening, because I realized in that moment that maybe there was something that students needed from me as their teacher that I didn't know how to give them. And that moment was really unsettling, because I think we as teachers, we want to do the absolute best, and we want to have all of the knowledge and all of the skills, and it is so unsettling when we realize we may not. So I started asking. I asked questions. The interventionist, who was about 20 years my senior, listened to me as I explained my frustration that my students were struggling so much with reading and writing. And she said, "You know, Barbara, it sounds like dyslexia." And I brushed up, "No, it's not dyslexia. They're not reversing their letters and their numbers," because that was my understanding of what dyslexia is. And she was very sweet and said, "You know, maybe you should read this book." And she handed me the book, Overcoming Dyslexia, which this is circa 2007. At the time, this was the iconic text, not only on dyslexia, but what's happening inside the brains of both neurotypical readers and readers who struggle. And I went home and I voraciously read this book, and as I read, I learned two huge things. Number one, dyslexia is the most common and prevalent of all known learning disabilities. Number two, we have had in 2007 decades of research and evidence showing exactly how the brain learns to read and what works best for student learning. And you know what happened? I got angry. Angry that I had never learned this. Angry that I, at this point, had about 10 years of teaching experience. I had a reading endorsement, and nobody had ever explained to me how the brain even learns to read, much less the fact that perhaps one of the reasons I had so many struggling readers is they have the warning signs of dyslexia. But that anger, it didn't make me quit, it made me curious. So I went back to graduate school to study language-based reading disabilities. And somewhere in the middle of that work, I remember having what I call my aha moment. And my aha moment is that there is a body of knowledge about teaching reading that teachers simply don't learn about. A body of knowledge that is grounded in cognitive science and linguistics. A body of knowledge that transcends curriculum and class size and socioeconomic status. And here's the thing, it is not our fault that we didn't learn it. But once we learn it, we have a responsibility to act on it. Maya Angelou says, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And that's when I understood something I had missed for years. This story of literacy and how our brains learn to read was not about intervention. It's about core instruction. Because the most important instruction that a child receives is in their Tier 1 core classroom classroom instruction with their gen ed teacher. And I also realized something else. For years, I had been mistaking effort for effectiveness. And here's the thing. Effort without clarity exhausts you. But with clarity, I went from feeling helpless to feeling equipped. For the first time in my career, I felt like I had some knowledge, I had tools, so I went back to my school, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, like a first-year teacher, ready to just share the word. And you know what happened? I heard a variety of responses that were something to the effect of, our curriculum is. Barbara, the way we do it is. And let me be clear, that response didn't come from administrators that don't care. It came from administrators who were doing the best with the knowledge and tools that they had at that time. But what we know also from research is that our beliefs shape our actions. Dr. Carol Dweck has spent decades researching this idea. And what she shared with the world is that the lens, the mindset with which we take in information has an incredible impact on what we actually do. And she says that when we believe that the knowledge we have is sufficient, we tend to protect it. When we are threatened, when we feel like we're uncertain or challenged, we default to what we know. We hold tighter to it because it's safer to protect what we know than to step into what we don't, even when something better is right in front of us. And that's the tension in education. The moment when we most need to change is the moment when we hold on to what we've always been doing. But here's the thing. If we truly want things to be different, we have to do things differently. And in 2010, I realized that our systems weren't ready to do things differently. So I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I left the classroom. And the reason this was such a hard decision is because my heart, my identity was tied to being a teacher. I often would refer to my kids as my students versus my biological children. They occupied a huge part of both my heart space, and I would lie awake at night thinking of my kids who struggled and me not having the ability to help them. But I left the classroom because I felt called to follow this knowledge, and I decided I was going to do two things. I was going to start offering workshops in coffee shops and in libraries, just sharing what I called at the time the reading brain. And I also started working one-on-one with students. I became a tutor. I wanted to see the methodologies that I had learned in graduate school come to life so that I could see how knowledge and doing connect. And what I saw blew me away. Students who had been scoring in the red made multiple grade level gains in reading fluency. Students who struggled to decode even a single word were now constructing sentences. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but it was effective. And even better, than the academic gains was watching these students become confident, capable, self-actualized learners. And I thought to myself, this is what happens when we give students the right instruction. But there was a problem. And the problem was, no matter how good of a tutor I was, no matter how many tutors were out there, we had both an equity issue and there was no way we could out-tutor what was really a core program of instruction issue. And so, upstream, I looked at the numbers and I said, for decades now, we have had not just a few, but the majority of students who are reading below basic levels. I'm not sure if you've seen the recent headlines. It's not going to be an uplifting stat, but Oregon is now ranked 50th in the nation for literacy. This is the problem that I wanted to help solve. And so, alongside a group of really dedicated educators and parents, we started advocating for change. We knew that teachers needed the knowledge to be able to know what to teach and how to teach it. And in 2015, Oregon passed Senate Bill 1003. Senate Bill 1003 allowed for one educator in every K-5 to receive comprehensive dyslexia-related training. And when that bill passed, we celebrated because it was progress. I spent most of 2016 and 2017 traveling across Oregon, from the coast to eastern Oregon, urban and rural schools, high and low socioeconomic status, training educators who were stepping into this work. And everywhere I went, I noticed something. There were always a small group of educators who leaned into this work, who stepped up and said, maybe there's something here I don't yet know. And there were also a significant number of educators who held tighter to what they've always done, who filtered the new learning through what they already believe works. And let me be clear, that doesn't make us bad educators, it makes us human. But I began to understand that before we can talk about how to teach and how to assess, we need to address belief systems. Are we open to learning something new? Because that's what we ask of our students every single day. We ask them to make mistakes. We ask them to learn something new. And the question is, were we willing to do the same? Because if we want things to be different, we have to do things differently. And when we do, something powerful happens. We start to change outcomes for students. Not just a few students. Not just the ones who would have figured it out anyway, but many more students than we ever thought possible. And for a long time, that felt way out of reach. But then in 2023, Tina Kotek signed into legislation the biggest investment in early literacy, with the goal of bringing evidence-based reading instruction to every single classroom. And this matters, because it stopped being about one teacher and one classroom or one school in one district at a time. It began to become about all of us. All of us, districts, and all of us as educators. And here we are. 2023, it passed. And I imagine that when you think about the students you work with, I want you to think about the ones who are working hard, the ones who show up every day ready to learn, the ones whose effort doesn't match their progress, the ones who carry that quiet weight of shame. For years, we've told ourselves a story in education. We've told ourselves that maybe 33% is the best that we can do. But the research tells us something very different. When children receive explicit, systematic instruction, especially in foundational skills in those early years, 95% of them can become skilled leaders. The delta between where we're at and where we can get to is our opportunity gap. And we're seeing that happen, not just in research, but in real places. Some of you might have heard of what's happening in Mississippi. Mississippi made a huge investment in early literacy. They call it the Mississippi Miracle, but I prefer to call it the Mississippi Marathon, because what happens there is not easy, it was not quick, and it was not accidental. Mississippi, as a state, invested in comprehensive teacher knowledge. I used to come into a school district and do a workshop and leave. And I learned over time, I refer to that now as pigeon PD. I come in, I drop a load, and I fly off. And we know that doesn't work, because we need the knowledge building, and we need modeling and coaching, and we also need systems that support effective implementation, and we have to stay the course year after year, because we didn't get here in 1 year or even 10, and it's going to take some time for us to get out. But in places like Mississippi, they did these things, and you know what happened? In one of the highest poverty, most diverse states, they went from the bottom to the top. It wasn't a miracle. And it started with a shared belief. This story is not so we can just hope that the same thing happens here in Oregon. We have to build the conditions for this to happen. Sometimes I think back to that intervention room where I looked in and saw students building words and had absolutely no idea what I was looking at. I had a teaching credential, I had a reading endorsement, and I didn't know what I didn't know. But here's what I know now. Those letters are not mysterious. They are powerful tools that show students how our language is built. And today, when I go into schools and see teachers using the same methodologies, I see something else. I see the moment a student finally gets it. You know the moment I'm talking about. The eyes widen, the smile that spreads across the face, the internal voice that says, I can do this. In those moments, I think that's why we continue to stay. Because the job isn't easy, the system does not make sense all the time, but every once in a while, we get to witness that moment. That hope, that joy, that possibility of a child discovering and realizing that something they thought wasn't for them is. Because success breeds success. And the thing is, we know what works. So if we know what works, and we need these moments of joy and possibility, the question is, how do we create more of them? This is Dr. John Hattie. John Hattie conducted the largest study in education, started back in 2008, where he looked at all of the research that's been done in education to answer a very simple question. What has the greatest impact on student achievement? And what he found was, it wasn't class size, it wasn't curriculum, it wasn't technology. The greatest factor on student achievement is something called collective teacher efficacy. Collective teacher efficacy is a belief. How powerful to know that the factors that we've often attributed to be the reasons that so many of our students struggle actually are not what the evidence points to. And of course, when we look at the data, and you can pull up his study and look at all of the factors, of course, evidence-based instruction has a very high statistical outcome. And the thing that precedes the ability for instruction to happen is the belief. The belief that we can do it, the belief that our students can do it, and the shared belief in a school that together we're better. John Hattie's study on collective teacher efficacy showed us that we need to actually make this visible. Because beliefs don't just happen, they come from relationships. Relationships with our students, relationships with each other, and relationships with ourselves. Because all learning is social and emotional. Students learn best when they feel known, when they feel safe to take risks, when they know that mistakes are part of learning, when they trust the adult in front of them. Research shows us that emotion and cognition are deeply connected. Social emotional learning and academic learning are not two separate issues, they are two sides of the same coin. Our students' brains are more open to learning when they see that the teacher in front of them believes in their ability to do the work. And of course, we as teachers, what do we need? I know coming out of COVID, so many of us felt incredibly drained because we had given, and that, for many of us, was a tipping point. How do we create systems where we support each other, where we collaborate, where we share what's working and also what's not working without fear. Because we do best when we work together. And we also need what's called self-efficacy. I have beat myself up for all of those students who passed through my classroom that needed something I didn't know how to give them, and I also didn't know how to talk to them about why this very thing might have been so hard for them. Of course, I wish I had a do-over. And the learning that's happened for me in this amazing journey through education has been understanding that we as teachers hold ourselves to an incredibly high standard. We want to be the expert. We do not necessarily embrace discomfort when we don't know what we're expected to know. Self-efficacy is the belief, the I can statement. I can, in spite of the environmental factors that feel sometimes like a hurricane swirling, I can influence student achievement. So often, we deliver those messages to our students, to those in our life who we love, and we don't often mirror them back to ourselves. Those moments that we talked about, those moments when a student says, I can do this, sometimes they come back to us years later in a card, telling us that what we did mattered, telling us that maybe we believed in them when they didn't believe in themselves. And we keep those cards. And we come back to them on the hard days. But here's something else that's true. We don't always get those cards. Those moments of gratitude, they don't always come back to us. And while we can't control that, what we can control is how we speak to ourselves. Can we offer ourselves the same grace and encouragement and belief that we so freely give to our students? So I decided today to do something. At the end of each of your rows, you have a bag. And in that bag, there is a card for each of you. And I want you to write a letter. Let's do this like a classroom. Go ahead and pass them out, and then I'll give you directions. We don't want cognitive overload. Put it back in the bag. That was a lot of directions at one time. But at some point in the future, that letter is going to find its way back to you, perhaps on a day when you might need it the most. And there's something I want you to remember. Those words that you just wrote, they're not hypothetical. They're true. They're based on your experience, your knowledge. And while that letter is for you, none of us do this work alone. We have to be part of environments where that belief is reinforced. Not just internally, but collectively. I'm going to give you one more minute. We had music, but music left us. One more minute to self-address your envelope, put it back in the bag. We will be stamping them, sending them to you. We will not read them. All the years of teaching is that you must be flexible and must adapt. You better know what to do when things don't go according to plan. So I want you to notice how that felt. Not what you wrote, but how it felt to write it. Imagine what happens when that belief takes root in the school. It has the power to transform learning. And that's where collective efficacy begins. Not in a research paper, not in a policy, but in the daily relationships between educators. And the beautiful thing is, it's happening in schools, and it can happen in your school. In your classroom conversations, in hallways, in the lunchroom. Because when we support each other, students feel it, learning changes, and those outcomes we talked about earlier, they start to move. And that brings me back to the intervention room. At the time, I thought the story of literacy belonged in that room. But now I understand something much different. The story of literacy doesn't belong just in an intervention room, it belongs in every classroom. Because the most important instruction is Tier 1 core instruction. And when that instruction is clear and explicit and grounded in how the brain learns to read, something extraordinary happens. Students believing that reading wasn't for them suddenly do. We see it in the smiles, in the eyes widening, in the I can do this. And those moments, I believe, are why we stay. Do we need knowledge? Absolutely. Do we need resources to support the implementation of that knowledge? Absolutely. Do we need systems that allow us to implement? Absolutely. And without that belief that we can do this, none of that matters. And that is why we stay. I know for me personally, when I'm needing a little bit of a reminder of why I continue to show up for this work, I turn to Rita Pearson. She delivered one of the most impactful TED Talks I've ever seen, and she finishes it with these words. We can do this. We're teachers, we're educators. We are born to make a difference. I've compiled for you some takeaways that you can bring back to your school, to your colleagues, to your administrators. Thank you so much me for lunch. Thank you.